Yakinkan orang dengan brand kita, kita kena yakinkan diri kita dahulu. So macam mana? Ilmu, knowledge. Pergi belajar. Tak belajar, tak tahu. Saya buka syarikat saya sendiri sebab masa itu saya yakin masyarakat tak boleh bergerak tanpa motivasi.
புதுசாக வித்தியாசமாக நீங்கள் யோசித்து ஒரு மார்க்கெட்டில் டிமாண்டாக இருக்கிற ப்ராடக்ட்டை நீங்கள் கொண்டு வந்தீங்கன்னா பயனராகவும் ஆகலாம். அதே சமயத்தில் மக்கள் திருப்பி வந்து உங்கள்கிட்ட வாங்கிட்டு இருப்பாங்க.
把你的生意放上网络平台。我朋友是做网络卖衣服的生意，他的生意是不断的在增长。我起步的时候是跟去银行贷款，所以他说我的规模也是太小，所以他是不接受我的贷款的。有一天我上网寻找贷款，然后过后就找到 IMSME， 过后我去 click 进去申请表格。第二天 CGC 的有一个顾问打来跟我说，你可以尝试用 P2P 的平台，过后就成功了。
The great thing about this whole CGC ISME program is that it's no collateral and you can go for as little as 1,000 ringgit to as much as 5 million. I went online and went to the page, registered, logged in and just keyed in my details, and from there within a matter of days things were already set in motion. So it's really that straightforward and that simple. I was able to get it within a matter of weeks. I think everyone can too.
IMSME ஃபண்டை வந்து நாங்கள் வந்து அப்ளை பண்ணியிருந்தோம், எங்களுக்கு கிடச்சிச்சு. அது மூலிமா எங்கள் பிஸ்னஸையும் வந்து எக்ஸ்பெண்ட் பண்ணோம். 10% வந்து இன்க்ரீஸ் பண்ணோம் எங்கள் சேல்ஸை. இது மூலிமா IMSME ஃபண்ட் வந்து ரொம்ப உதவியாக இருந்துச்சு எங்களுக்கு.
Sebenarnya dalam business, fun is everything. You have fun, you can go bigger. You don't have fun, you cannot go anywhere. CGC banyak membantu saya untuk saya go and move further sebenarnya. Dan at the end, saya dah ada branch baru dekat Alustah selepas saya dapat dana daripada CGC. I have no fun problem at all after that. Jadi dengan IMSME memang banyak sangat ubah hidup saya dan banyak membantu mengembangkan bisnes saya.
感谢 IMSME 帮我的生意更上一层楼。
Always have a support structure that you can rely on, having people that can always deliver, and at the very least, those that can show progress on a daily basis.
Kita adalah brand holder. kita kena yakin dengan brand kita. So sebelum kita nak meyakinkan orang dengan brand kita, kita kena yakinkan diri kita dahulu. So macam mana? Ilmu, knowledge. Pergi belajar. Tak belajar, tak tahu. Saya buka syarikat saya sendiri sebab masa itu saya yakin masyarakat tak boleh bergerak tanpa motivasi.
புதுசாக வித்தியாசமாக நீங்கள் யோசித்து ஒரு மார்க்கெட்டில் டிமாண்டாக இருக்கிற ப்ராடக்ட்டை நீங்கள் கொண்டு வந்தீங்கன்னா பயணியராகவும் ஆகலாம். அதே சமயத்தில் மக்கள் திருப்பி திருப்பி வந்து உங்கள்கிட்ட வாங்கிட்டு இருப்பாங்க.
把你的生意放上网络平台。我朋友是做网络卖衣服的生意，他的生意是不断的在增长。我起步的时候是跟去银行贷款，所以他说我的规模也是太小，所以他是不接受我的贷款的。有一天我上网寻找贷款，然后过后就找到 IMSME， 过后我去 click 进去申请表格。第二天 CGC 的有一个顾问打来跟我说，你可以尝试用 P2P 的平台，过后就成功了。
The great thing about this whole CGC ISME program is that it's no collateral and you can go for as little as 1,000 ringgit to as much as 5 million. I went online and went to the page, registered, logged in and just keyed in my details, and from there within a matter of days things were already set in motion. So it's really that straightforward and that simple. I was able to get it within a matter of weeks. I think everyone can too.
IMSME ஃபண்ட் வந்து நாங்கள் வந்து அப்ளை பண்ணியிருந்தோம், எங்களுக்கு கிடச்சிச்சு. அது மூலிமா எங்கள் பிஸ்னஸையும் வந்து எக்ஸ்பேண்ட் பண்ணோம். 10% வந்து இன்க்ரீஸ் பண்ணோம் எங்கள் சேல்ஸை. இது மூலிமா IMSME ஃபண்ட் வந்து ரொம்ப உதவியாக இருந்துச்சு எங்களுக்கு.
Sebenarnya dalam business, fun is everything. You have fun, you can go bigger. You don't have fun, you cannot go anywhere. CGC banyak membantu saya untuk saya go and move further sebenarnya. Dan at the end, saya dah ada branch baru dekat Alustah selepas saya dapat dana daripada CGC. I have no fun problem at all after that. Jadi dengan IMSME memang banyak sangat ubah hidup saya dan banyak membantu mengembangkan bisnes saya.
感谢 IMSME 帮我的生意更上一层楼。
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh, and a very good morning and welcome to ADFIM Sustainable Financing Sharing Experiences webinar. As you may already be aware, the demand for environmentally friendly and sustainable practices has coincided with the rise of climate change to the top of the global agenda. And scientists have warned that the world has reached a tipping point in addressing climate-related issues with damaging consequences for future generations should our actions fall short. There is a pressing need to green the ecosystem for a more sustainable future. Malaysia, as we are aware, is a signatory to the Paris Agreement on Climate Change and a party to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. Under the Paris Agreement, Malaysia has committed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% of GDP1 by 2030. And to maintain at least 50% of forest and tree conservation. The current ongoing pandemic has increased the importance and caused setbacks for us to achieve these sustainable development goals. As such, despite the pandemic, ADFIM embarked on international knowledge sharing since 2019. Besides discussions on SDG white papers, we have organized international online forums, and today, we bring to you a webinar of experience sharing from experts across the world. To begin the program this morning, I would like to invite Encik Izwan Zainuddin, the chairman of ADFIM, to give his welcoming speech. Encik Izwan.
Thank you, Mr. Prasad. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and very good morning. Encik Adnan Zaylani, Mohamad, Zahid, Assistant Governor of Central Bank of Malaysia, Council Members of Association of Development Financial Institution Malaysia, or AFIM, fellow eminent speakers and experts from auctusESG, CENDB, World Bank Group, AFIMI, Turkish Investment and Development Bank, and respected guests and participants. Selamat datang and welcome to this high-level webinar on sustainable financing experience, webinar on sustainable financing experience sharing. Let me first say how grateful I am to each and every one of you for joining us today. Its impressive turnout shows that sustainable financing is no longer a niche, but it's a ongoing mainstream. Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic has been a wake-up call prompting governments, businesses, investors to pay greater attention to environmental, social, and governance, and stimulating all stakeholders to chart the sustainable recovery. The pandemic has revealed not only our vulnerability as a society, but also critical importance for sustainable development. In the case of development financial institution, it brings to light the importance of sustainable financing. Sustainable finance sets an opportunity for global players to refocus on the benefits of sustainability and responsible investment. While firms go through the recovery phase, they need to look at the new reality in which delivering sustainable finance will be imperative. I think this webinar is timely for us to realign our financing schemes to include the return not only in financial, but also environmental, social, and governance. Therefore, since last year, ADFIM has been a strong proponent of sustainable development agenda, organizing various engagement sessions and forums with domestic and international partners. ADFIM has organized 3 international forums with experts from Qatar Development Bank, DFCC, Bank of Sri Lanka, China Development Bank, and ASEAN Development Bank, as well as IPDCC Finance from Bangladesh, and many more. As an association, we strive to continuously engage with various stakeholders, including government ministries, to champion the sustainable development agenda, specifically on sustainable financing. Therefore, today, we continue to bring recognized speakers from around the world in various time zones to share their experience in sustainable financing, as well as sharing their trend, and we hope to see for the what in the future. We have speakers from World Bank of the United States of America, Ms. Fiona Stewart and Mr. Michael Fuchs, CENDB Canada, represented by Ms. Diana Smallridge, auctusESG India, represented by Ms. Namita Vikas, and Turkish Investment and Development Bank, represented by Mr. Coskun Kanberoğlu. Today's webinar is an important step in mobilizing the broad support needed to turn this strategy into practice. The various players are here today: DFI executives, businesses, civil society regulators, supervisors, central banks, and others. All have a part to play. The webinar will go on until 4 p.m. Malaysian time today. We will have 4 speakers that will give us ideas and experience for us to set out the way forward. I hope you will leave this seminar today inspired by ideas that you will hear and equip your argument to convince others back in your organization. And I invite you all to act as ambassadors for sustainable finance. I hope the participants will engage with speakers throughout today's webinar, and we have provided Q&A opportunities for each session. I would also like to thank our sponsors, Bank Pembangunan Malaysia, Malaysia Technology Development Corporation, Perbadanan Nasional Berhad, our Pernas, and CGC Malaysia for their wonderful support. With that, I would like to conclude my speech by encouraging the delegates to participate with an increasing number in all the activities and discussion throughout the digital platform. I wish everyone a successful, safe, and fruitful webinar. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and thank you very much for the welcoming speech, Encik Izwan. And for everyone's information, today we have a total registration of over more than 400 participants, and I believe it will be a full house until the evening. Without much ado, one of the key drivers and stakeholder for Malaysia to achieve our SDG is the Central Bank of Malaysia. Without much ado, I would like to invite Mr. Adnan Zaylani, Assistant Governor of the Central Bank of Malaysia, to give his opening speech. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Prasad. Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good morning. Encik Izwan Zainuddin, Chairman of Association of Development Finance Institutions of Malaysia. Encik Mohamad Prasad bin Hanif, Secretary General, Association of Development Financial Institutions of Malaysia. And ladies and gentlemen, fellow speakers, thank you firstly to the Association of Development Financial Institutions of Malaysia, or ADFIM, for organizing this webinar. I'm honored to be invited to deliver this keynote address. Certainly the theme of this webinar is highly current and crucially important, and it looks to grow even more so as we weather through this unprecedented health crisis and economic downturn. The economic challenges are many, and the economic fallout of the crisis are deep and in some cases worsening. At the global level, some of the forecasted statistics are staggering. So the global economy is projected to suffer losses up to $8.8 trillion. As many as 150 million will be pushed into extreme poverty by 2021. Global unemployment could exceed 200 million in 2022. Women make up 39% of global employment, but will account for 54% of overall job losses. More than 50 million people were doubly hit in 2020 by climate-related disasters as well, in addition to the threats of COVID-19. So most of these indicate an expected regress in our sustainability agenda. On the other hand, there are claims that the climate has benefited during this crisis, but it has come about in a far than ideal situation with such high human and social costs. Indeed, as these costs look set to accumulate further with the ongoing crisis, there's much for us to do. Most of this naturally will be led by government. A whole of government approach, whole of nation is absolutely necessary in dealing with the challenges. Development financial institutions as instruments of policy and agencies of government will thus have a critical role to play, in particular to deal with the economic and financial challenges faced by businesses in the economy. We are well familiar with the role of DFIs as complementing the market-based and commercially driven financial institutions. This already calls for DFIs to adopt a balanced approach to financing, promoting and supporting public interests or development initiatives. Some would involve higher risks, in particular in new ventures or industries, or financing those who at the margins are unable to obtain financing under normal commercial terms from financial institutions. All this while at the same time managing risks and ensuring long-term financial sustainability. Let's not forget DFIs are also generally required to make a reasonable return on capital and are answerable for the use of public funds. In this crisis, we have also emphasized a need to act counter-cyclically. That is to continue extending, even expanding financing when most commercial-driven financing takes a highly risk-averse approach. In 2020, Malaysian DFIs rose to this challenge. Financing outstanding by DFIs grew by 7.7%, outpacing the commercial bank's growth of 0.8%. Since 2020, DFIs also administered more than 1 billion of funds for the government to the underserved groups of businesses and facilitated about 36 billion ringgit of repayment assistance restructurings to nearly 270,000 individuals and businesses. All this is commendable, but while supporting the economic recovery will continue to be a top priority in the near term, as institutions designed with developmental mandates, DFIs ought to embrace sustainability as their existential purpose. One could argue that the developmental mandates of DFIs, which preceded the foundation and adoption of the sustainability goals, had already reflected them. Ending poverty, zero hunger, reducing inequalities, gender equality, industry and economic growth, climate, the environment, and others, by and large, are goals and sectors that DFIs are already involved in. They are not new to DFIs. However, by embracing sustainability, this would heighten the purpose and sharpen that focus for DFIs to enhance the delivery of these mandates and play a key role within this system to support our economy towards a better future. This brings me to my first point. DFIs can help reshape the economy through sustainable finance as part of the post-pandemic rebuilding efforts. This entails using financing to nudge businesses and consumers to adopt practices that promote resilience and good governance while growing sustainability and protecting the environment. The need for this is undeniable and inevitable. Increasingly, we see more of Malaysia's industries and companies face scrutiny. Sorry about that. Increasingly, we see more of Malaysia's industries and companies face scrutiny and challenges in their international business due to unsustainable and questionable practices. As an example, let's consider the palm oil industry. This has been one of the largest industries that has contributed immensely to the country's economy for quite some time. Yet it's an industry that needs to overcome real and perceived unsustainable practices and reduce its impact on the environment. If left unaddressed, this could threaten the long-term viability of this sector and threaten domestic employment and industry. Palm oil players need to transform many aspects of their operations to achieve sustainability, and DFIs can play a catalytic role in this transformation. Firstly, DFIs can prioritize financing agri-tech to enhance the climate resilience of the palm oil industry, promote trust in terms of product origin, and upscale the value chain of palm oil. Some examples of these technologies are blockchain application, which can improve traceability of palm oil inputs and contributing towards better acceptance of palm oil produce from Malaysia. Precision farming, which benefits the environment through more targeted use of inputs that can reduce wastage from excess applications, as well as financing new growth areas that Malaysia is developing competitive advantages in, such as biodiesel and green oleochemicals. Secondly, DFIs can consider providing sustainability-linked loans to encourage smallholders to work towards adopting relevant sustainability certifications. As more plantations embrace sustainability practices, this will enhance the industry's international reputation and may even elevate Malaysia to become a global leader in sustainable palm oil. At the same time, the income and livelihood of smallholders would also improve as their output benefits from the better market access. DFIs could consider adopting the Value-Based Intermediation Assessment Framework or VBIAF sectoral guides on palm oil developed by the Islamic financial industry, which provides guidance on overlaying credit or investment decisions with ESG considerations. Thirdly, DFIs can onboard or nudge plantations to work towards enhancing the living conditions of estate workers by incorporating this as part of the credit assessment process. This ensures palm oil plantations meet the basic needs of workers, such as access to safe drinking water and proper housing. These are specific use cases where sustainable finance can contribute towards strengthening Malaysia's sustainable economic growth. But in order to execute this well, DFIs need to work with other partners across the public and private sector, which leads me to my next point. DFIs are often constrained by the size of their balance sheet or capital and take on outsized risks in specific sectors in serving their mandates. On the other hand, the private sector may have larger financial capacity, but is traditionally more inclined to support low-risk and well-served customers, whilst high-risk customers are either left out or are charged quite expensively to buffer for uncertainties. In overcoming these challenges, DFIs ought to collaborate with other entities in mobilizing capital and diversifying risk across different institutions, thus providing an opportunity for the private sector to participate in these segments within the comfort of their risk tolerance. In parallel, DFIs need to continuously build their internal expertise and deepen their understanding of the sectors or segments through regular engagement with the industry, as well as enhance industry analysis, leveraging on access to data within the government. This would augment DFI's credibility to lead and crowd in the private sector towards participating in innovative funding structures. There are two noteworthy solutions that DFIs may wish to find ways to adapt to the local context. Firstly, a risk-sharing facility that can catalyze private capital. This entails offering instruments that enhance the private sector's willingness to finance high-risk segments. For example, USAID partnered with the Medical Credit Fund in Africa in providing $1 million of catalytic first loss capital, which successfully drew in 17 million debt financing from impact investors. So MCF in turn worked with African financial institutions to provide loans and technical assistance to healthcare SMEs in providing quality healthcare services, as well as ensuring business sustainability. Secondly, the use of blended finance while offering financing instruments that promote customer resilience. Blended finance typically involves mixing different sources of funds to reduce overall borrowing costs. With the lower cost of funds, DFIs may wish to explore offering instruments that can either enhance the bankability of customers or lower the financing costs for customers. During the pandemic, the British Business Bank administered a blended equity financing model to support startups that may otherwise be shunned by commercial banks. Under this model, eligible startups receive a convertible loan with a matching amount based on equity raised prior to the pandemic. The convertible loans will be converted into equity upon exit or maturity with no repayment expected throughout the tenure. Closer to home, one of Malaysia's DFIs has recently made headway in sustainable finance through an inaugural issuance of sustainability sukuk. The sukuk has been well received by the market, oversubscribed by more than 3 times, with the proceeds going towards supporting the government's sustainability goals by financing SMEs involving green projects identified under the Green Technology Master Plan, Malaysia. Other DFIs are also preparing to issue more sustainability sukuk, which will also deepen the sustainability bond market in Malaysia. This development augurs well for the creation of a vibrant fundraising market that will better support the economic recovery and financing of sustainable and impact projects. My third point is that various frameworks are now being put in place to empower DFIs in sustainable finance, and DFIs can already step up efforts in this space. For example, Bank Negara Malaysia's climate change and principle-based taxonomy facilitates all financial institutions to be part of the driving force that promotes orderly transition towards a low carbon future. Other frameworks focus on creating incentives that would shape DFI's behavior to be more in tune with their developmental goals. The adage, what gets measured gets managed, reflects the importance of building a structured and holistic measurement framework for DFIs. This will support DFIs to pursue national economic and social well-being, while simultaneously support an orderly transition of the economy towards achieving sustainability goals. In this, it is particularly pertinent for DFIs to advocate accountability, transparency, and efficiency, since DFIs are also public institutions. Towards this, DFIs that are part of the value-based intermediation or VBI community are encouraged to apply impact-based disclosure on value-based practices and financial solutions, contributing to the triple bottom line. Institutions are required to disclose an optimal set of information to stakeholders with an objective to generate intended market discipline and promote stakeholder activism. Similarly, the Performance Measurement Framework, or PMF, is anchored on the concept of additionality creation by DFIs. Additionality is defined as a positive impact attributable to DFIs beyond purely commercially driven considerations, and this resonates well with the intent of sustainable finance. Under the framework, an achieving DFI creates additionality by addressing market failures and creates values for the economy. This could be in generating employment, increasing income level, as well as creating economic spillovers for local communities. It could also be in successfully mobilizing private investments or financing to support strategic or underserved sectors or markets through innovative financial instruments, or creating an enabling environment for customers to flourish by actively contributing to the sound design and implementation of public policies. During this journey of PMF, one of our Malaysian DFIs has been piloting an impact assessment framework that was jointly developed with the World Bank that provides a holistic and structured end-to-end assessment, which includes accounting for selected ESG aspects. The DFI has reported some preliminary 2020 results wherein 2,600 jobs were created with an estimated 2,628 gigawatts of clean energy being produced, among other reported impacts. We look forward to other impacts and achievements garnered through the delivery of sustainable finance. Finally, it's worth reminding that while regulation can be an important driver in elevating and mainstreaming sustainable finance, it is a sum of many parts which can truly create a seismic change. DFIs should look for like-minded partners across the public and private sector to collectively advance the national goals of achieving sustainable development. We see industry collaboration and collective action as a critical component of achieving higher, wider, and more impactful societal and economic goals. This is evident through the work done under VBI, where several DFIs are part of the community of practitioners. The community of practitioners pools resources and expertise, enabling members to accelerate learning as well as drive several common initiatives, such as the issuance of VBI sectoral guidelines. Another important driver for sustainable finance is the need for it to be institutionalized and embraced throughout the organization with clear leadership or a tone from the top. This will ensure that a clear message resonates throughout the organization of the commitment and intent that can then drive organizational initiatives supported by the necessary infrastructure and systems to create change. With that, I come to the close of my remarks. I would like to wish you all a productive webinar and all the best in this important journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Encik Adnan, on that keynote address. And I believe we have a lot that we have gained from Encik Adnan's keynote address earlier. Now, we will proceed immediately to our presentations this morning. But before we begin, we have a few housekeeping rules. The first one is participants will not have access to audio visual to ensure that there is minimal interruption. And number two, Q&A will be conducted through the Q&A button, not the chat box or the audio visual. It will be through the Q&A button. So you will see in your Zoom screen a Q&A button. Please use that to ask any questions. This is to ensure that the Q&A is conducted timely as well. You may also post a question using the Q&A box anytime during the presentation. However, the questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. So once the presentation is over, we will address the Q&A questions in the Q&A box. We hope that clarifies this morning's structure. Well, to continue, the World Bank Group has a treaty-based relationship with the United Nations that dates back to its founding. And through that relationship works to build partnerships that supports member states and contributes to effective development outcomes while preserving the distinct mandates of each institution. 2015 was a historic year with the adoption of a new approach to the development finance through the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, the 2030 Agenda, and the Sustainable Development Goals, a disaster risk framework in Sendai, and the Paris Climate Agreement at COP21. These efforts will guide the United Nations system and the United Nations World Bank Group partnerships through 2030. The SDGs are aligned with the World Bank Group's twin goals of ending extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity. And the World Bank Group is working with client countries to deliver on the 2030 agenda through three critical areas: finance, data, and implementation, supporting country-led, country-owned policies to attain the SDGs. This morning, we have two experts from the World Bank Group that will share with us on the topic of green finance, aspirations and achievements, a reality check. Ms. Fiona Stewart, the lead financial sector specialist, is part of the long-term finance team in the World Bank's Finance, Competitiveness and Innovation Global Practice. Fiona provides policy advice on pension and insurance market reform to governments around the world and is currently working on projects in East and Southern Africa, Indonesia, and Georgia. Previously, she worked on the for the OECD's Financial Affairs Division for 8 years and led the Secretariat of the International Organization of Pension Supervisors, IOPS. Prior to working at the OECD, Fiona worked in the pension fund industry. As head of the American Express Asset Management in Japan, she was responsible for investing $2 billion in Asian equity markets. And as part of an international team for managing $20 billion globally. She holds degrees from Oxford and Johns Hopkins Universities and a chartered financial analyst qualification. She also served on the advisory board of one of the OECD's own pension funds. Michael Fuchs has extensive experience in financial sector development, working for the World Bank, and for the past 8 years as a consultant to the World Bank and other donors. Working recently in Africa and East Asia, Michael has focused on deepening markets for productive finance of enterprises, infrastructure, and housing, on competition in the banking system and reforming the role of development finance, and on tailoring regulation and supervision for the financial sector to the needs of emerging markets. Michael has also led evaluation work within the financial sector. Until June 2013, Michael was advisor and acting sector manager in the finance and private sector department of the World Bank's Africa region. Starting in 2002, Michael worked extensively on financial sector development in the Africa region, leading financial sector assessments in 8 countries and for the group of countries in the East African community, as well as policy reform and technical assistance operations, including in Kenya and Nigeria. Before joining the African region, Michael worked for 8 years in the World Bank's East and Central Asia region, 5 of which focusing on Russia in the wake of the financial collapse in 1998. Prior to the World Bank, Michael was employed by the Danish Central Bank and the Danish Ministry of Finance. He has his PhD and MA from the University of Copenhagen and his BA from the University of York, United Kingdom. So welcome to the stage, Fiona and Michael, and selamat datang to you as well. So the stage is yours, Fiona and Michael. Oh, you need to unmute. We still can't hear you, Fiona. Can you try again? Suddenly it doesn't work. Still can't hear you. We did the audio test earlier. It was working fine. The Khairul, the live monitor is actually muted as well. Khairul? Let me just get that sorted out. Encik Khairul, the live monitor is muted. Oh, okay. So the technician says it's your mic actually, Fiona. Can we recheck the mic again? We still can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear Michael.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Fiona's going to dial in again, I think.
Oh, she's going to try to join again. All right.
That's a nice thing to do.
This is the, how you say, the challenge with technology. We might test everything earlier on. So we'll wait for Fiona to join us, to rejoin us.
Is that working now?
Yes, now we can hear you clearly.
I'm
Great.
so sorry. I apologize, everyone. I don't know why that happened. It was fine in the test earlier. these things happen. We've all had these with webinars, but it's great to see you all. Apologies for that, and good to see you all this evening. Lovely introduction from the governor, I think, has set the stage very well. For outlining also, a presenter has also outlined beautifully the ambitious but very exciting role that we all play at development banks in these very challenging times, both to recover from the pandemic and to deal with the climate challenges that are coming towards us. And increasingly, actually, I think Malaysia is a good example of also taking on not just climate, but nature as the new climate. So these interlocking challenges that we have. I'm going to start from the big picture. Where are we with green finance globally? What are some of the big trends? I'll hand on to Michael, who will look a little bit more in depth at the role that we play as development banks. And you'll hear, I think, later in the day from experts, real experts in the field, experts from the development community. So let me just start with the big picture. Now, I hope this bit of technology works. Let me see if I can get my slides up. That's the next challenge. There we go. Is that working?
Yes, we can see the slides.
Great, that part worked. Very good. So we've said, we've entitled a speech tonight for aspirations and achievements, and a bit of reality check on where we are with green finance. There's a lot of momentum. There's a lot of really good intentions and achievements coming through, some of which the governor actually has just outlined. But we think they also need a reality check, because we really need to go from intention to implementation. We think this is the next big step. And the development banks, you all play a very important role in helping the finance community globally make that next step. So what are some of these global trends that we're talking about? Well, you could almost say there's a tsunami of green finance, a tsunami of regulations and networks and commitments and declarations are coming through at the moment to try and address these interlocking waves, these interlocking tsunamis of not just the COVID crisis, which is showing the debt challenges that many countries have, combined with the climate and then the biodiversity challenges that are coming towards us. Lots of very interesting initiatives coming through on disclosure and reporting. Many of you will know about the TCFD is one, the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure. There's now a TNFD for nature, and international harmonization of sustainability standards is going to be, I think, a big game changer and a really important step up that we'll all have to deal with. Lots happening on the risk management front. Many of you, I'm sure, will be part of these initiatives, the NGFS, the regulators for Network for Greening the Financial Sector. We have the Coalition of Finance Ministers who've come together, and also the central banks and the development banks themselves. Lots of very good work going on in risk management and work across the international community to harmonize a lot of these standards. So there's really is a lot going on in the international community that will touch all of our shores. It will come to Malaysia, it will come to all of the emerging markets. However, I think there's still a case that some regions and some of the emerging markets are still lagging very much these trends, and there is catch-up needed. Just to give you two examples, if you look at issuers in the green bond world, we've hit $1 trillion of green bonds, and it's a very interesting and growing market. A lot of it is still coming out of Europe. China's been a very large market, so Asia is relatively well represented. Africa is still only 1% of that market, so it's really not a global market yet. There's still more to be done. Latin America is starting to catch up, but the issuance side, it's not really a proper global market yet for this important green finance tool. Equally, on the investor side, if you take, many of you will know, and I hope some of you are signatories to the UN Principles of Responsible Investment, again, very much led by Europe, quite a lot of US signatories. And I know our UN PRI colleagues are very keen to really make this a global movement. They have representatives in Asia, increasing signatories from there, but they really want to make this global and make sure on the investor side, as well as the issuer side, that this is a global movement that really takes hold. And we've seen this exponential growth in regulation in the last few years, particularly the last couple of years. It's been growing really, really strongly. The UNPRI actually have a very good database of this regulation globally. They have 700 and more laws now looking at regulations for pension funds, for stewardship codes on the corporate governance side, for corporate disclosures for the companies that are listed on the exchanges, for example, the sort of ESG reporting that they have to do. The type of regulation really has grown very, very strongly in the last few years. And we're seeing, again, it started a lot from Europe, but regionally, we're working in a lot of countries around the world. In the Asian region, the South Africa dot there is an interesting one. Some of Latin America, I was working in Colombia recently on regulations. It's really is this very strong international framework, and national frameworks are starting to come out that all of us as financial institutions, including the development institutions, will be having to follow and comply with. The other trend I would say we're seeing is it was very much ad hoc. So it was an instrument here, an instrument there, an initiative over here. Somebody had a taxonomy, somebody had a green bond framework, somebody else might have had reporting or stewardship framework. There's an interesting trend, I think, coming that we're seeing more national initiatives to try and pull a lot of these very good individual regulatory and other initiatives together into a national standard, a national sort of holistic plan for greening finance. There's one in Canada at the moment, for example. In Canada, they have an expert panel that's looking at things like how do we have a national taxonomy, etc. The Canadians are working on theirs at the moment. Europe, many of you will know, I'm sure, that this high-level expert group on sustainable finance that have come out with a very comprehensive set of regulations, including a taxonomy and other standards coming out through Europe. China has a Green Finance Committee. Again, there's been a lot of different initiatives from various institutions in China in the last few years. And this committee is trying to very much pull that together to have a holistic approach and an overarching strategy for the financial sector. And certainly in my country, in the UK, if you want to look at a good strategy, I think the UK one was actually very good, I have to say. I commend my colleagues, my compatriots in the UK, their green finance strategy, I think, was a particularly good one. So there's a lot of this national approaches, I think, starting to come through, which I think is very good for really getting the momentum and making sure that we have a joined up approach to sustainable finance and greening our markets. And I think the key question really now for a lot of the emerging markets is, how do we go from intention to implementation? And we hear a lot of these international standards. The European taxonomy is one, for example, that a lot of countries are looking to and saying, well, can we just pick that up and apply into our own country? Can we just take that? And we think it's very important to make sure that a lot of these standards really fit the context of the country. So this is just one example I was giving for the Africa region, working with some supervisors in the Africa region. And we were talking about a lot of Europeans have an approach, their ESG, their environmental sustainability approach is divestment. So they might divest of certain fossil fuel or high carbon sectors. But that's very difficult in the context of a stock market where it's very, very concentrated. And in some of the exchanges around the Africa region, for example, you have a very, very few stocks that really dominate the turnover of the exchange. And in that context, it's very difficult to have a divestment strategy if one of those stocks comes from the fossil fuel high carbon sector. So you can't just necessarily pick up a European approach and put it into a different region. So I think we have to think very carefully about how we take these international standards and make sure they really apply properly to the countries that we're working in. And again, I think the development banks have an interesting role to play here. So how do we move forward from this idea of intention to implementation? And I think what we're seeing around the markets is there's not necessarily just one tool or one approach. There can be different elements. It could be through asset owner regulation. Sometimes it's these ESG regulations for the pension funds, etc., that can be driving. Sometimes it's the corporate governance, the stewardship codes. I think the governor outlined very well the extremely important role that the financial sector can play to change behavior in the corporate sector, in the real economy. He laid that out very well, and these stewardship codes, I think, have done a good job of that, of making those connections. Could be corporate disclosure, as I mentioned, from the companies listed on the stock exchanges, these financial strategies, the national strategies and the taxonomies. Different elements can be used to try and be the catalyst and the lever to really start to move forward and to really embed these sustainability practices into our financial markets. And what I've certainly found interesting is there's different levers in different countries. So one example, it can sometimes be the market, it can sometimes be the investors. The big investors can be the drivers of change. And I think that's been some interesting examples of that around Asia. So we were doing some work with the GPIF, which is the government pension fund in Japan, which some of you will know it's the big elephant of the pension world. It's the biggest pension fund in the world. It has $1.5 trillion, huge pension fund. And a few years ago, they decided that they wanted to introduce ESG right across their investment portfolio. And that had a huge impact, obviously, on the asset managers that they use, but it had a very big influence in Japan, and I think around the region as well, that the GPIF was standing up and making these changes. We've also been doing some work with the big pension fund in Thailand. The government pension fund is one of the biggest funds in Thailand. And again, they very much want to be the catalyst of change, the driver for greening their own domestic markets. They're one of the biggest investors in their domestic markets. And the methodology that they've tried to use, again, really adapting international practice. They used MSCI, many of you will know as an important ESG data provider, but they know their markets, they know their local market. So they took that international data and adjusted it for the process and the way of looking at the markets and the ESG that they think really reflects the local conditions best. So it's been an interesting example of a sort of methodology that's been developed for the local markets by the pension fund to have an influence on the whole of the financial sector. In some other countries, it can be the regulators that drive change. Again, the governor was mentioning the importance that regulation can play in being a catalyst. It's not necessarily the only one, but it can be an important one. I think that's what we've seen in Latin America. There's been some very good driving from the regulators in terms of particularly corporate governance. When we think about environment, social governance, the ESG, the Latin America started really with the G, with the governance side of things, and very good sort of corporate governance they started with. They're now moving on more to the E and then I think the S eventually, but starting to roll that out. But very good guidance, regulation, interaction between the regulators and the market players has been quite a big drive across Latin America. I mentioned Colombia, where I was doing some work recently. They've been very, very active, the regulator there. South Africa has been interesting. Again, very strong early regulation on the governance side, but also on the social, which is incredibly important for the concept of the just transition in South Africa. And we've had codes like the Black Economic Empowerment codes, etc. So the social impact has always been seen as a very important lever and priority in the South African context. So sometimes it can be the S, and sometimes regulation can move in that direction earlier than you might expect. Again, it depends on the country and the context. So what we've done at the bank, we've put together a toolkit for what are all these different building blocks? What are all the potential policy levers that you could use to start to green the financial sector? We've laid these out, given just a very high level of what they might involve, and some examples from countries that have used them. That's available, and happy to share that and to give you a sort of picture, I think, then of where you sit, the role of the development banks within this broader financial architecture. And when we're working on these toolkits, what we usually do, we usually start obviously with a benchmarking to try and see the situation in the country. and then to identify the gaps and to see what can be the sequencing, what can be the prioritization. How do you start? That's often the question we're asked. Again, a lot of intention, but really difficult to take the first step sometimes. How do we get going? It can be very daunting with all these different tools and taxonomies and green bonds. Where do we start? So doing some good benchmarking is where we usually start to try and give the advice to countries on how to move forward. Just two examples. We've done some benchmarking of some of the biggest pension funds around the world. You mentioned the GPIF in Japan as one of them. They wanted to know, what should we be reporting as the pension funds? How do we report our ESG? How do we report what we're doing? So we laid out what we thought would be good practice based on a lot of international standards and looked at some of the leading pension funds in the world to see how they were doing. We found a lot of them doing good work in terms of talking about their governance, their strategy, less so explaining how they're dealing with climate change, less so on how they actually choose their asset managers for ESG, for example. And from there, we can help give some advice and some good examples for how to move forward. Likewise, we were looking at, it's fine for the pension funds to want to invest and have an ESG approach, but if the companies they're investing in don't give them the necessary data and information, it's very hard for them to change their practices. So we always try to look at the two halves, the two sides of the coin, as we say in English. I don't know if you use that expression in Malaysia, but it's the other half of the coin, the other side of the coin, the investing companies, what they are reporting. Work we've done with the UNPRI on what would be good reporting for listed companies. This was an exercise we did for the Colombian pension funds. And you can see some of the areas on the governance are quite well covered. Once you start to get into the E and the climate, there's much less data available. So again, we were able to work with the Colombian regulator to say, these are some of the indicators you should be advising listed companies that they should start reporting on. And that's the way to start to step by step move forward and embed these practices. And we think it's also, again, back to my sort of theme that's running through, that the regulatory approach needs to fit the country context. So we did this exercise with some students from Columbia University. I always love working with university students. It's always good fun and very inspiring. And looking at which countries' pension systems are particularly exposed to climate change. So that was looking at countries that are very highly exposed to climate change, at high risk, plus they have a very big pension assets, plus those pension assets are largely invested in their own country. So there's very little diversification. South Africa is a good example of that. And then we can see how much regulation to deal with that has been put in place. So South Africa has quite a high risk, but hasn't had a very developed regulatory approach as yet. So that's why we think it's up in that high quadrant. Malaysia is quite interesting. So a country with relatively high risk, but actually you've done quite a lot already. And the governor outlined some of the practices, but quite a bit of regulations already been put in place. So you could argue that Malaysia has a regulatory framework that's dealing and looking at and starting to recognize the climate risk in the country better than maybe some of its peers. This is just some examples of journeys and how countries have moved forward, which I think is again, is an interesting sort of showing it's a step-by-step approach. In Chile, right back in sort of 5-6 years ago, the regulator, certainly of the pension funds, the securities regulators, they started to really think about how you would start to get a sustainable investment practice into your pension funds, which are very large in Chile. And it was very much gradual. It was very much a dialogue between the regulator and the pension funds. They realized that there was quite a lot of G, of good corporate governance, as I mentioned, but less very much particularly on the E. So they started to put out some dialogue and some guidance for the pension fund around 2018. They started to incorporate it into their own risk-based approach to supervision, how they were looking at the pension funds themselves. And then from 2019, some national agreement on how this should be done was put together. And over the next couple of years, the pension funds are going to be expected to incorporate that into their investment policies. So it's an interesting, very collaborative journey that the Chilean system has been on. Likewise, in South Africa, they were very early adopters of codes on corporate governance. And this stayed very much voluntary for many years, through about the first 10 years or so. It stayed very much voluntary, but it wasn't really seeing much movement in terms of the actual investment practices of the financial institutions. So in the last couple of years, you've seen a bit of a step up from the regulators in South Africa, from softer guidance to moving towards harder regulation to really try and help the funds, the banks, the insurance companies really embed these practices and take on this risk from climate and environment that's coming in South Africa. But they're also doing a lot to help with guidance as well. They're not just saying you must do this, but they're also saying here is how we can help you comply. So some very interesting work going on, I think, at the national level in South Africa at the moment. Let me just very quickly start to look at the role of DFIs, and I will hand on to Michael to talk about this in some more detail, and you will hear a lot more from the practitioners, the boots on the ground later from your peers internationally. Just to say, within the toolkit that I mentioned, we have a couple of sections looking at both how to set up a green development bank, but also how to green existing development banks. And those are choices. Different countries have taken those different choices in this way to set up a new institution or to try and embed these practices into existing development institutions. The governor said, I think this very, very eloquently earlier, exactly laying out the really important role that you play between the domestic, international, and the local private sector, and the national governments, and even the smaller DFIs. You can have a really big influence on the investment climate and policies in your countries. The counter-cyclical role that can be played is very important. And as I say, it's not necessarily setting up a new institution, but how to help institutions like yours really take on this sustainable finance policies and approach. And there's some initial ideas around this in the toolkit. Actually, my colleagues, literally as we were setting up, just sent me a very good guide that the International the Development Bank for Latin America, the IADB, has just put out a guide. So I would urge you to go and look at that. They've just been sent to me, and they have a very good guide to help institutions like yours start to embed these practices as well. Just a couple of examples of things. One was, again, the governor mentioned, I think, but the very interesting role the development banks played last year in response to the COVID crisis, a lot issuing these COVID bonds. So went to the market to raise financing, which was then used for health and other emergency spending and support last year. The Council of Europe Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, good examples. The bonds that they issued, I know they were purchased by the Dutch and the Scandinavian pension funds, for example, and you were investors in some of those European bonds last year that went into the COVID recovery. So it's a very good sort of counter-cyclical support role that the development banks stood up and played last year, including the World Bank. We had a very large response emergency package that came out globally from the World Bank as well last year. Some of the sort of checklist we have in a toolkit for how you would start to embed these practices. Again, the governor, I think, laid out some of these very well, starting with your mandates. What is your mandate? Identifying, are there barriers in your mandate that would stop you adopting some of these practices? In many cases, as he laid out, not. Your mandates are very compatible with thinking about environmental, social development goals, etc. It's very much in the DNA of our institutions, but making sure that it maps to what you are laid out to do, I think, is important. Assessing any barriers and assessing if you need further funding to do that, to meet those goals. Clearly identifying then what your objectives are, communicating those, and training, even at the very highest level, must come from the board, is very important. We've seen this with implementation. And then following on with the monitoring, the evaluation, and even staff incentives to move towards these really embedding green practices in your development banks. A couple of examples we have from a couple of different ways of doing this. So if you take somewhere like Belize, they took the approach, their development bank, of really trying to embed climate environment into all of their programs. That was the approach that they took. In contrast, the DBSA, the South African Development Bank, they had a target. So they had a target of 35% minimum towards green and other projects that really support the climate and NDC goals of the country. So sometimes it can be ring fencing a particular part of your portfolio. Sometimes it can be really embedding it right across your portfolio. And again, that would depend to a large extent on the mandate of the institution. So that's a big overview, I think, of where we are globally with the regulatory and other factors that are really driving this really strong stimulus for green investments. A little bit of the role of the development banks. Let me hand on to Michael, and he's going to run you through some of his experience with development and investment in the last few years, and what we can learn from other sectors like infrastructure. But let me hand on to Michael. Thank you.
Thank you very much. These were hard acts to follow, but I shall try. As Fiona says, I'm going to try and bring some of this a bit more down to earth, if you like, in some of the dilemmas which I think development banks actually meet in trying to implement sustainable finance policies. In the next slide, Fiona, you're going to continue doing the slides. In the next slide, you can see estimates of what is regarded as a necessary investment and the range of investments to keep the temperature on this planet within control, and what is actually happening with the amount of finance available for such purposes. The needs are much, much bigger still, even though the amount of funding is increasing gradually. The needs are huge compared to the amount of available finance. That's led to a discussion, which is kind of natural under the circumstances, about how we use development finance. And this is not a new discussion, but kind of been evolving over time. So we need to strengthen, as Fiona also said, and the governor, strengthen the mandates and incentives to deliver transformative climate action. But perhaps also as important, or more importantly, we need to bring new investors and sources of finance because of the huge gap there is, and the investment needs are so huge. And find ways also of doing so effectively. So things like pooling small projects together, finding ways of funding them together, and issuing bonds to do so. That's not a simple process. And then we have the concessional finance, which is available to drive this transformation process. And again, there, as was also said before, we need new instruments. We need to use those instruments very efficiently as well, such as guarantees and syndication. And we need to get over some other risks, such as foreign currency, which is often a risk in this space because much of the finance actually provided is in foreign currency. But the overall message is a greater focus on mobilizing commercial investment, as well as strengthening the investment enabling environment. So the needs are huge compared to what's available. Now, I've taken this slide from some work I've been doing actually in Africa for the past 8 years or so on trying to address some of these financing issues. And what you find is that it's a kind of these steps in this escalator, which move from pure government financing of investment, of infrastructure investments, to some donor concessionary financing also being involved, to commercial banks and investors getting involved as well, particularly in construction finance, and then gradually moving to capital market solutions. It is if you like, a natural progression in this, and moving up this escalator is a difficult task. I think in Malaysia, you're fairly well advanced in that sense compared to many other emerging markets. But still, the process of involving the private sector requires extra effort. It doesn't happen of its own accord. It's much easier to finance something by the government or through a development bank, for example, and not bother too much about leveraging that finance from other sources. So the agenda I'm going to kind of pursue in this presentation, I'm going to talk a bit about the role of DFIs and the potential role of SDG incentives, and what potential there is there, and what the main hurdles we need to overcome in actually making more finance, using the finance we have available? Why is it so important to look beyond just the kind of the role of the government finance and look into how we can stimulate the private finance? The usual bottleneck in this context isn't actually finance, it's the projects. There aren't enough projects to finance. There is finance available to finance those projects. So it's making the two ends meet. And in that context, I want to make a kind of case for focusing more on what we call project development facilities. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So starting at the top, we talk about development finance institutions, and some of this has already been said, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but development finance institutions can be local partners and investors in low carbon and climate resilient projects. They can increase the bankability of by developing financial products and mitigate investor risk, drive project developers and investors to adopt impact matrices, and track progress towards sustainable targets. And they can demonstrate technical and economic feasibility of new technologies and build understanding and capacity of the financial sector and assist policymakers to create better enabling environment for climate resilient low carbon finance. That's all. And the diagram on the right also kind of emphasizes the role of mobilizing the private investment and building market solutions and implementing the SDGs. And in there's the strong governance that has been spoken about before as well as being a focal point. Now, all these are great aspirations. I mean, it's really the question is, how do we implement these aspirations? And if you go to the next slide, that progress so far on involving the private sector, and this is just a number of examples from different countries of how development banks finance themselves. The involvement of the private sector is quite small, something like 20%. The rest of the funding channeled through development finance institutions comes from government, bilateral foreign agencies, multilateral development banks such as the World Bank, and others. So the challenge is, I think, to turn this upside down. 80% of the funding should come from the private sector and 20% should come from all those other sources. So we have a huge challenge in front of us. Even though we have good intentions, we still only just started to scratch the surface of implementing those intentions. Going to some of what has been spoken about already before as well, that one of the ways that development finance institutions work, of course, is they invest directly, but mostly, many of them do invest through other instruments or other parties, whether it's through credit lines, by investing equity or bonds, or providing guarantees and technical assistance. They are actually very active in stimulating other institutions, financial intermediaries in doing investment on their behalf. So one of the questions is, how can you align those financial intermediaries' investments with the Paris Agreement? And there's a question in the next slide, which is posed by, in this context, was posed by the World Resource Institute and an institution called German Watch. And they have suggested ways of doing this. So depending on the level of sophistication of the kind of accomplishment, if you like, in looking to the Paris Agreement criteria, they suggested different ways of making investments. So where financial investments, where financial intermediary investments use DFI funds and satisfy the Paris Agreement criteria, that's okay, but it's of course a rather limited way of looking at the achievement of that institution. So they're not doing it for their whole balance sheet, they're just doing it with the funds provided to them. So that's the C group here. And for that C group, they are suggesting, well, then you can use certain earmarked vehicles and SPVs and technical assistance, but you shouldn't engage more broadly with an institution like that. It's only where the institution as a whole is implementing Paris Agreement criteria, you can actually use equity investments, credit lines, guarantees, and bonds. And on the right-hand side of this figure, you see those you shouldn't really touch because they're not doing what they should in the climate space. So that's one way of kind of trying to manage that alignment discussion. And it's certainly, that's certainly a helpful way, I think, of thinking about how you can transition from where we are now to a better situation. I'll skip the next one, Fiona, and go to the one afterwards. But I think there's a question here when you're looking at these rather indirect these measures of what's going on. The question is, what impact are we actually having? Investors want to go further and see actual strategy change. And here I'm thinking of, well, it's fine that you do this through the different criteria that you might impose on financial intermediaries that you invest in, but where are you actually seeing change? So are they actually, there's a suspicion there might be some arbitrage going on here. Some institutions find suitable investments and they don't necessarily create new ones that live up to carbon emission targets. And investing assets under management has grown significantly in trying to live up to these criteria. They're using what I call negative screen solutions, which ensure policy alignment, and ESG integrated solutions, which ensure that material sustainability factors are considered in investment analyses, but they don't really necessarily mean there's a measurable positive impact on sustainability issues. So are we actually making that impact? Can we actually designate, can we actually identify an impact on the investments being undertaken? So that's the kind of question posed here. And that's why what I would call intentional impact investing sounds as kind of more the target, which I think DFIs should have in mind in trying to make sure that there isn't just a reshuffling, if you like, to a process by which we are living up to certain criteria. We aren't actually necessarily increasing the amount of investment in the climate-friendly space. So I want to go on to discuss that a bit more about how you might go about that. It's not easy. In fact, it's very difficult.